The Berlin Wall, part of the Iron Curtain that cut Europe in two. Beyond the wire, armed force had always held down the peoples of the communist world. In 1989, the wall was still intact, but there was a new mood in Moscow.
The use of force had discredited itself completely. It was no longer possible to stabilize the world by military methods.
We saw a real opportunity because of this recognition on the part of the Soviet Union that they weren't going to win an arms race. They weren't going to, quote, bury you, unquote. We were the beneficiaries of this.
December 1988. Gorbachev met George Bush and outgoing President Ronald Reagan. Gorbachev had decided that the Cold War must be brought to an end. The Americans remained cautious.
There were pressures on Mr. Gorbachev from his right, if you want to call it that, from his military, God knows from who else, who didn't want to see the rapidity of this change.
By 1989, Gorbachev was determined to loosen Soviet control over the nations in the communist bloc. Gorbachev told the peoples of Eastern Europe that they had the right to choose their own futures. But his listeners wondered what would happen if non-communists won power. Would the Soviet Union really stand aside?
Gorbachev was convinced that when these countries got their freedom, they would choose socialism with a human face. He believed they would not turn away from Moscow, nor run off to the West. He thought they would be grateful to Moscow and keep up ties of friendship with the Soviet Union.
But not everybody wanted freedom from Moscow. Communist leaders like East Germany's Erich Honecker relied on Soviet support to stay in power.
To imagine that the Soviet Union, after 40 years of alliances, would leave every socialist country to fend for itself and turn its back on them as if there had never been a brotherly community, this was unheard of.
Hungary, 1956. Soviet tanks smashed the Hungarian attempt to win democracy and independence. Imre Nagy and the other leaders of the uprising were executed. Economic reforms improved life for a while, then hit disaster. By 1989, the communist government was losing control. But Soviet troops remained in the land. The Hungarian people were growing angry again. Fear drove the regime to promise political changes and more democracy.
The country was close to an abyss, close to a total crisis situation. Economically, we accumulated by that time a huge debt. Politically, all the key players within the country realized that there is no way to get a better life via reforming the socialist model.
In March 1989, Prime Minister Nemeth visited Moscow. The Hungarian leaders were planning free, multi-party elections. But would this be too much for Gorbachev?
I said, I don't know as of this moment when we will have the first elections. But knowing that you stationing in the territory of the country roughly 80,000 soldiers, and having in mind the experience of '56, when your tanks crushed the revolutionaries and all the forces who fought that time for freedom, will you repeat the '56 exercise or not? And Gorbachev, without hesitation, responded quite clearly to me. I don't agree with the multi-party system, the introduction of the multi-party system in Hungary. But that's not my responsibility, that's your responsibility. There will be no instruction or order by us to crush it down. So that was quite important message.
A nameless grave in Budapest hid the murdered leaders of the 1956 uprising. Now the government agreed to rehabilitate them, the dead and the living. Erzsébet Hrozova was 18 when she fought in the uprising. She spent 12 years in prison.
I felt as you do when a plaster is removed, and at last you can breathe freely. You don't have to lower your head anymore. I felt I could breathe again.
Imre Nagy and his comrades were given a public funeral. The government declared that the 1956 revolution was justified. The crowd listened to the names of the martyrs.
I was stunned to see that on that list, young boys, when they imprisoned them, arrested them, they were 16 years old. And they waited till they celebrated their 80th birthday. And next morning, they killed some of them. The reburial meant to us a reconciliation with our past and history. It meant a new start, a fresh start, especially in the political side of our life, and a renewal.
A month before, the Cold War had lost a symbol. The Hungarian government took down the barbed wire on its border with Austria and the West. The Soviet Union did nothing. Although travel was still not completely free, the Iron Curtain was starting to unravel.
I refused to give to the Home Minister money in that year's budget for the renewal or the refurbishment of the old barber wired system.
They said that the Iron Curtain was technically obsolete. It didn't work as a barrier anymore. They should not maintain a construction that endangered people's lives.
Hungary's boldness alarmed the hard-line Warsaw Pact leaders. None was more shocked than the East German ruler Erich Honecker. His state formed the Soviet Empire's frontier with the West.
Honecker's first reaction was to send the Minister of Foreign Affairs to Moscow to protest against this decision. Moscow's answer was, "We can't do anything about it." This was unique. It was the first time that Moscow had said anything like this to us.
The Poles, like the Hungarians, were breaking with the communist system. Faced with a wave of political strikes led by the opposition movement Solidarity, the regime had given way.
I knew that the communist system was finished. The only problem was, what would be the best way to get rid of communism?
In 1981, with Soviet approval, Solidarity had been crushed by the Polish army. Its leaders were imprisoned. Now, in early 1989, the government opened round-table talks with Solidarity. The Polish communists were prepared to share power, to discuss a shift towards democracy.
Democratic institutions were being formed. They were substitutes for a full democracy. But we were different compared to the other countries of the bloc. We were, in a way, a heretical island.
In June, elections were held. They produced a stunning defeat for the communists. Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. Within weeks, the first anti-communist prime minister in the Soviet bloc took office.
When we knew that Gorbachev was thinking about reform, we saw he would not oppose our reforms.